you know, as I look out at this crowd, you're pretty young, so I don't know if you're gonna, I hope this makes sense. But when we talk about 1938, I was born in 43, but this show had such an impact that it was repeated over and over, years and years in different parts of the country. In fact, I have a radio group called Great Plains Radio Theater, which started back in 2007, and we premiered on the stage of the Orpheum Theater, which was, it's really awesome to be on the stage of the Orpheum Theater. And we went back for a second production, but our show, the premiere at the Orpheum Theater, we had about 500 people, and it was War of the Worlds, the actual word-for-word script that was written by Orson Welles and John Houseman. So, but what I want to talk about today is look at what caused the hysteria of people who listened to a radio show of Martians invading the East Coast and then the whole world. And it's a fascinating story. Let me just, I can't go back through the entire background of Orson Welles, but he was only 23 years old when he produced this radio show on the New York radio station for CBS. And he had been known as a radio voice actor for a number of years before that, so he was kind of a young boy genius. He played The Shadow, which was a mystery radio series before this broadcast. And he decided to come up with something called Mercury Theater on the Air. And the Mercury Theater on the Air was a group of actors, voice actors, many of them handpicked by Orson Welles, who later became quite famous, people like Joseph Cotton, for example. But they got their start in radio. And the beauty of radio was that if you go back to the 1930s, radio was the first opportunity to have live voices in your home. In those days, there would be a piano maybe in the parlor. There would be maybe an organ. People would go out to vaudeville, or they'd go out to a movie theater to see a movie. But for the very first time, radio brought into the home live events, news events and so forth, as well as radio shows. And many of the radio shows were done live because they didn't have tape recorders and that type of equipment to be able to pre-record. But they did have telephone lines. And so the old telephone lines that ran all across the country also carried the network connections for radio stations all over the country. So if you were on the East Coast and there was a program being broadcast live in a studio in New York City, you could still hear it because it was connected by telephone lines to the affiliated station on the West Coast or Midwest and so forth. So Orson Welles, and there's a younger picture of him, and then later on in life, he went on to produce a number of films. And then the Mercury Theater on the Air, jointly created by John Houseman and Orson Welles. They were very close friends. John Houseman was a grain dealer from Kansas, and then he got into radio and then became well known in the movies and so forth. They were close friends until a movie that was produced, which is considered one of the most impactful movies ever made, called Citizen Kane. Orson Welles starred in that. I used to teach film history, and Citizen Kane was a requirement, one of the requirements for the students to watch, because it had so many twists and turns in it and was based on a real person. But John Houseman got into a very strong disagreement with Orson Welles during the filming of Citizen Kane. And at one point, Orson Welles had a temper, and during a meal, he always had food that was brought in when the actors were sitting around getting ready to do a show. He had an enormous appetite, as you can see in the later pictures, but he always had food. And he got in such an argument with John Houseman that he picked up a flaming dish of some pasta and threw it across the room and almost hit Houseman. That was the end of their relationship from then on. But it kind of shows you the impact and the creativity, the genius aspect of a person who also has some very deep psychological issues, as happens with many people of that caliber. So I want to tell you what was happening in 1938 around the world. You had the Great Depression, which was continuing. It started shortly after 1929 crash and was continuing up until World War II broke out. So 1938, we're still in the Great Depression. We had the invention, discovery of lysergic acid. The hallucinogenic acid was first discovered. The first binary code for computer was developed, and that's the 0 and 1 language that computers used. Nestle develops instant coffee. They were the first to come up with instant coffee. The first Superman comic was published in 1938. But there were some really strange things happening in 1938. Keep in mind, when the broadcast went over the air, it was Halloween Eve. So that's October 30th. And the night of October 30th is sometimes referred to as Devil's Night or Mischief Night. That's when kids go out and they smash pumpkins and, soap up windows and that type of thing. And so he thought that would be a good night to run this broadcast. In March, the Nazis invaded Austria. Also that month, a German physicist split the atom. In June of 28, there was a 450-ton meteorite that struck Pennsylvania. On September 21st, 700 people were killed by a hurricane that occurred in the Northeast. It hit Long Island and then caused quite a bit of damage in southern New England. It was called they didn't name the hurricanes back then, so it was called the Great Hurricane of 1938. On October 1st, Germany, under Hitler, occupies the Sudetenland, which was at the time part of Czechoslovakia. And people also had memories of the Lakehurst, New Jersey disaster when the German airship, the Hindenburg, blew up. A number of people died in that event. And a coelacanth, which is a historic fish, was caught off the coast of South Africa in 1938. Everybody in the world assumed that the coelacanth died 40 million years ago. And they have proof that the coelacanth existed 400 million years ago when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. And so imagine that, 1938, these fishermen pull up this 6.5 foot, that's about 2 meters long. Here's a picture of the airship disaster in Lakehurst, New Jersey. Here's a very blurry picture of the coelacanth that was caught off the coast of South Africa. So you had all these really ominous events happening, And of course, the invention of the atom, being able to work with atomic energy, created all kinds of fear among people. And then, of course, Halloween is approaching, and people were getting in the spooky mood. So imagine all these things happening all within the same year. The broadcast was on WABC radio in New York City, which was a CBS radio station affiliate, as I said, at 8 p.m. on October 30th. On a competing station, which was NBC in New York, the Edgar Bergen, Charlie McCarthy show, which was called the Chase and Sanborn Hour, based upon Chase and Sanborn Coffee, that sponsored the program. So here you have a ventriloquist and a dummy on the radio. And people say, how can you have a ventriloquist on the radio? You can't see the dummy, you can't see the mouth move. But everybody loved Charlie McCarthy and recognized his voice, Edgar Bergen's voice. And of course, he had been on radio for years. And so it was a very popular show, and it came on at the same time, 8 o'clock, as War of the Worlds started. So what happened is the ratings for the Chase and Sanborn Hour on the scale was 34.7, and that's translated to so many million people. The regular ratings for Orson Welles' Mercury Theater on the Air was like 3.4. So 10 times the number of people would be listening to Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. When the show started, this is really interesting. When the show started, there was a disclaimer at the beginning that this is a fictitious broadcast based on the classic book of the same name, War of the Worlds. And everything started. Now, let me give you an example. We get some sound here.
On this particular evening, October 30th, the Crosley service estimated that 32 million people were listening in on radios.
That's Orson Welles.
Much change in temperature. A slight atmospheric disturbance of undetermined origin is reported over Nova Scotia, causing a low-pressure area to move down rather rapidly over the northeastern states, bringing a forecast of rain accompanied by winds of light gale force. Maximum temperature 66, minimum 48. This weather report comes to you from the Government Weather Bureau. We take you now to the Meridian Room in the Hotel Park Plaza in downtown New York, where you will be entertained by the music of Raymond Raquello and his orchestra.
So the way this unfolded was that everything was done live, and this happened a lot in those days. They would broadcast from a hotel ballroom or some other location. And as this progressed, there were interruptions in the show, and I'll play you some clips of that. And it got more urgent and more urgent as the show progressed, and the music became more agitated. And that helped really get the audience involved. Let me go to the next series and just show you.
On this particular evening,
There's Orson Welles directing the War of the Worlds and the actors. There were other actors in there in this shot. But here's a interruption, another interruption to the program.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity. Professor Pearson of the observatory at Princeton confirms Farrell's observation and describes the phenomenon as, quote, like a jet of blue flame shot from a gun, unquote. We now return you to the music of Ramon Raquello, playing for you in the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel, situated in downtown New York.
Okay, meanwhile, the majority of the audiences in New York and other parts of the country were listening to Bergen and McCarthy's show, but you had a pretty significant number, maybe a million and a half people listening to this show. And another interruption happens.
Ladies and gentlemen, following on the news given in our bulletin a moment ago, the Government Meteorological Bureau has requested the large observatories of the country to keep an astronomical watch on any further disturbances occurring on the planet Mars. Due to the unusual nature of this occurrence, we have arranged an interview with the noted astronomer, Professor Pearson, who will give us his views on this event. In a few moments, we will take you to the Princeton Observatory at Princeton, New Jersey. We return you until then to the music of Ramon Raquello and his orchestra.
So Orson plays Professor Pearson throughout this production. And the next...
Professor Pearson has passed me a message which he has just received. Professor, may I read the message to the listening audience?
Certainly, Mr. Pross.
Ladies and gentlemen, I shall read you a wire addressed to Professor Pearson, Dr. Gray, of the Natural History Museum, New York. Quote, 9:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Seismograph registered shock of almost earthquake intensity occurring within a radius of 20 miles of Princeton. Please investigate. Signed, Lloyd Gray, Chief of Astronomical Division. Unquote. Professor Pearson, could this occurrence possibly have something to do with the disturbances observed on the planet Mars?
Hardly, Mr. Phillips. This is probably a meteorite of unusual size, and its arrival at this particular time is merely a coincidence. However, we shall conduct a search as soon as daylight.
Thank you, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, for the past 10 minutes, we've been speaking to you from the observatory at Princeton, bringing you a special interview with Professor Pearson, noted astronomer. This is Carl Phillips speaking. We are returning you now to our New York studio.
And Carl Phillips is the reporter working for the CBS station.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity. Professor Pearson of the observatory at Princeton confirms Farrell's observation and describes the phenomenon as, quote, like a jet of blue flame shot from a gun, unquote. We now return you to the music of Ramon Raquello, playing for you in the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel, situated in downtown New York. Ladies and gentlemen, following on the news given in our bulletin a moment ago,
Ladies and gentlemen, I shall read you a wire addressed to Professor Pearson. Passed me a message which he has just received.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Okay, there's Frank Reddick, who was the character that played Carl Phillips. And what happened in the show is that he's actually on site at Grover's Mill, New Jersey, where this object landed near a farm. And in this clip, he's reporting basically what he sees.
We take you now to Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Carl Phillips again, out at the Wilmot Farm, Grover's Mill, New Jersey. Professor Pearson and myself made the 11 miles from Princeton in 10 minutes. Well, I hardly know where to begin. Paint for you a word picture of the strange scene before my eyes, like something out of a modern Arabian Nights. Well, I just got here. I haven't had a chance to look around yet. I guess that's it. Yes, I guess that's the thing directly in front of me. Half buried in a vast pit. Must have struck with terrific force. The ground is covered with splinters of a tree. It must have struck on its way down. But I can see the object itself doesn't look very much like a meteor. At least not the media as I've seen. It looks more like a huge cylinder. Has the diameter of, what would you say, Professor Pearson?
What's that?
What would you say, what's the diameter of this?
About 30 yards.
About 30 yards. The metal on the sheath is, well, I've never seen anything like it. The color is sort of yellowish white. It's curious. Spectators now are pressing close to the object in spite of the efforts of the police to keep them back, getting in front of my line of vision. Would you mind standing on one side, please? While they're pushing the crowd back. Here's Mr. Wilmot, owner of the farm here. He may have some interesting facts to add. Mr. Wilmot, would you please tell the radio audience as much as you remember of this rather unusual visitor that dropped in your backyard? A step closer, please. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Mr. Wilmot.
Well, I was listening to the radio.
Closer and louder, please.
Pardon me?
Louder, please, closer.
Yes. I was listening to the radio and kind of drowsy. A professor fellow was talking about Mars, so I was half dozing and half...
Yes, Mr. Wilmot, and then what happened?
Well, as I was saying, I was listening to the radio, kind of halfway.
Yes, Mr. Wilmot, and then you saw something.
Well, not first off. I heard something.
And what did you hear?
A hissing sound like this. Kind of like a 4th of July rocket.
Yes, then what?
I turned my head out the window and would have sworn I was asleep and dreaming.
Yes?
I seen a kind of greenish streak and then zingo. Something smacked the ground, knocked me clear out of my chair.
Well, were you frightened, Mr. Wilmot?
Well, I ain't quite sure. I reckon I was kind of riled.
Well, thank you, Mr. Wilmot. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you want me to
No,
tell
that's
somebody?
quite all right. That's plenty. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard Mr. Wilmot, owner of the farm where this thing has fallen.
Okay.
We take you now to Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
What happened on the Bergen show, Charlie McCarthy show, is that about 15 minutes in, the host of that show went to a musical interlude. And just as people do channel switching today, people were switching channels on the radio. And a lot of the listeners said, well, I don't want to listen to this music, so they start changing the channel, and they picked up CBS. And they picked up CBS at the moment that these creatures start coming out of the capsule, the space capsule. Now remember, they didn't hear the openings, so they didn't hear the announcement that it was a play, a radio play, fictitious. And so this is when a sizable number of the listeners for the Bergen McCarthy show switched to CBS, and this is what they hear.
Well, casing is definitely extraterrestrial. Not found on this Earth. Friction with the Earth's atmosphere usually tears holes in a meteorite. This thing is smooth, and you can see it's cylindrical
Just a
shape.
minute. Something's happening. Ladies and gentlemen, this is terrific. This end of the thing is beginning to flake off. The top is beginning to rotate like a screw, and the thing must be hollow.
He's moving! Keep back! Keep back! Keep those men back! Keep back! Keep those idiots back! Keep on! The top float out there! Stand back!
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Wait a minute. Someone's calling someone or something. I can see coming out of that black hole two luminous discs. The eyes, it might be a face, might be almost the heavens. Something wriggling out of the shadow like a gray snake. Now it's another one, and another one, and another one. They look like me. I can see the thing's body now. It's large. It's large as a bear. It glistens like wet leather, but that face, ladies and gentlemen, it's indescribable. I can hardly force myself to keep looking at it. It's so awful. The eyes are black, and they gleam like a serpent. The mouth is kind of V-shaped with saliva dripping from its rimless lips. It seems to quiver and pulsate, and the monster, or whatever it is, can hardly move. It seems weighed down by possibly gravity or something. The thing's rising up now, and the crowd falls back. They've seen plenty. The most extraordinary experience, ladies and gentlemen. I can't find words. Well, I'll pull this microphone with me as I talk. I'll have to stop the description until I can take a new position. Hold on, will you please? I'll be right back in a minute.
So obviously when
We
people...
are bringing you account of what's happening on the Wilmot Farm, Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
So when people heard this, they were so enraptured by what they heard that they didn't even think about checking the other channels where nothing suspicious was going on. They were totally drawn into what was happening. Now keep in mind, that same year is when the airship, the Hindenburg, blew up. And what's significant about the airship Hindenburg disaster in New Jersey, by the way, same location, roughly, is that the reporter on the scene, this became the first live broadcast in the history of radio of a disaster. And the actor who played Carl Phillips, Reddick, he patterned his response very similar to what that reporter seen in Hindenburg blow up and his style. And of course that drew people in. They said, oh, here's another live event. You know, we're witnessing another disaster. Now here is the next clip. And we're going.
We now return you to Carl Phillips at Grover's Mill.
Ladies and gentlemen, my honor. Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of the stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmot's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk and as long as I can see. More state police have arrived. They're drawing up a cordon in front of the pit. About 30 of them. No need to push the crowd back now. They're willing to keep their distance. The captain's conferring with someone. Can't quite see who. Ah, yes, I believe it's Professor Pearson. Yes, it is. Now they've parted, and the professor moves around one side, studying the object while the captain and two policemen advance with something in their hands. I can see it now. It's a white handkerchief tied to a pole. Flag of truce. Those creatures know what that means, what anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. A humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror and a big strike at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. The field caught by the woods, the fires, the gas tanks and the automobiles spreading everywhere. Coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill. Evidently, there's some difficulty with our field transmission. However, we will return to that point at the earliest opportunity.
So the announcer obviously doesn't want the public to think that there's some danger. He's trying to keep his cool and just say there's some technical difficulties. We'll report back. And here's basically
definitely
what happens.
We now return you to Carl Phillips at Grover's Mill.
The Earth's atmosphere usually tears holes in a meteorite. This thing is smooth and...
Ladies and gentlemen, my honor. Ladies and gentlemen, nothing's happening. Ladies and gentlemen, here I am.
Well, okay, get to the next one.
Stone wall that adjoins.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been handed a message that came in from Grover's Mill by telephone. Just one moment, please. At least 40 people, including 6 state troopers, lie dead in a field east of the village of Grover's Mill. Their bodies burned and distorted beyond all possible recognition. Ladies and gentlemen, I have just been informed that we have finally established communication with an eyewitness of the tragedy. Professor Pearson has been located at a farmhouse near Grover's Mill, where he has established an emergency observation post. As a scientist, he will give you his explanation of the calamity. The next voice you hear will be that of Professor Pearson, brought to you by direct wire. Professor Pearson.
Of the creatures in the rocket cylinder at Grover's Mill, I can give you no authoritative information, either as to their nature, their origin, or their purposes here on Earth. Of their destructive instrument, I might venture some conjectural explanation. For want of a better term, I shall refer to the mysterious weapon as a heat ray. It's all too evident that these creatures have scientific knowledge far in advance of our own. It's my guess that in some way they are able to generate an intense heat in a chamber of practically absolute non-conductivity. This intense heat they project in a parallel beam against any object they choose by means of a polished parabolic mirror of unknown composition, much as the mirror of a lighthouse projects a beam of light. That is my conjecture of the origin of the heat ray.
Thank you, Professor Pearson. Ladies and gentlemen, here is a bulletin from Trenton. It is a brief statement informing us that the charred body of Carl Phillips has been identified in the Trenton Hospital.
Okay, so that's the end of Carl Phillips.
Take you now to the field headquarters of the state militia near Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
Now the troops are on the edge of the Wilmot Farm. 7,000 armed men closing in on an old metal tube. A tub, rather. Well, shadow, it's something moving. Solid metal, kind of a shield-like affair rising up out of the cylinder. It's going higher and higher. It's actually rearing up on a sort of metal framework. Now it's reaching above the trees and the searchlights are on it. Hold on.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a grave announcement to make. The battle which took place tonight at Grover Mills has ended in one of the most startling defeats ever suffered by an army in modern times. 7,000 men armed with rifles and machine guns pitted against a single fighting machine of the invaders from Mars. 120 known survivors. The rest strewn over the battle area from Grover's Mill to Plainsboro, crushed and trampled to death under the metal feet of the monster, or burned to cinders by its heat ray.
Speaking from the roof of Broadcasting Building, New York City, the bells you hear are ringing to warn the people to evacuate the city as Martians approach. Estimated in the last 2 hours, 3 million people have moved out along the roads to the north. Hutchison River Parkway is still kept open for motor traffic. Avoid bridges to Long Island, hopelessly jammed. All communication with Jersey Shore closed 10 minutes ago. No more defenses. Our army is wiped out. Artillery, Air Force, everything wiped out. This may be the last broadcast. We'll stay here to the end. People are holding service here below us in the cathedral. Now I look down the harbor, all manner of boats, overloaded with fleeing population pulling out from docks. Wait a minute, the enemy's now in sight above the Palisades. Five great machines. First one is crossing the river. I can see it from here, wading the Hudson like a man wading through a brook. A bulletin is handed me. Martian cylinders are falling all over the country. One outside of Buffalo, one in Chicago, St. Louis. Seem to be timed and spaced. Now they're lifting their metal hands. This is the end now. Smoke comes out, black smoke drifting over the city. People in the streets see it now. They're running toward the East River, thousands of them, dropping in like rats.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been handed a message that came in from Grover's Mill by telephone. Take you now to the field headquarters of the state militia police near Grover's Mill, New Jersey. Lie dead like the field east of the village of Grover's Mill. Their bodies burned and distorted beyond all possible recognition.
Continue after a brief interval.
Solid metal.
This is the
shield-like
roof
affair
of
rising up out of the cylinder.
I've just been informed that they have finally established communication with an eyewitness on track.
The roof of
Professor Pearson has been located at war.
Let me try to stop this here. Okay.
Near Grover's Mill, where he is now.
Okay. And what happens with the reporter on the roof is this black smoke approaches. it's poisonous, it kills him, and that's the end of that particular broadcast. And
You are listening to a CBS presentation of Orson Welles at the Mercury Theater on the Air in an original dramatization, The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. The performance will continue after a brief intermission. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
okay, now that was 44 minutes into the show that they went ahead and did another announcement that it was a fictitious broadcast. But by then, people were away from the radio, running down the streets, jumping in their cars, driving out like crazy. And I'll read you a couple of eyewitness descriptions of the people that were involved in this panic. And then the final description at the very end of the show was Professor Pearson describing what happened to the Martians.
Suddenly I caught sight of the hood of a Martian machine, standing somewhere in Central Park, gleaming in the late afternoon sun. An insane idea. I rushed recklessly across Columbus Circle and into the park. I climbed a small hill above the pond at 60th Street, and from there I could see standing in a silent row along the mall 19 of those great metal titans, their cowls empty, their steel arms hanging listlessly by their sides. I looked in vain for the monsters that inhabit those machines. Suddenly my eyes were attracted to the immense flock of black birds that hovered directly below me. They circled to the ground. And there before my eyes, stark and silent, lay the Martians with the hungry birds pecking and tearing brown shreds of flesh from their dead bodies. Later, when their bodies were examined in laboratories, it was found that they were killed by the putrefactive, and suddenly I caught sight of the hood of a Martian machine, standing somewhere in Central Park, gleaming in the late afternoon sun. An insane idea. I rushed recklessly across Columbus Circle and into the park. I climbed a small hill above the pond at 60th Street, and from there I could see standing in a silent row along the mall 19 of those great metal titans, their cowls empty, their steel arms hanging listlessly by their sides. I looked in vain for the monsters that inhabit those machines. Suddenly my eyes were attracted to the immense flock of black birds that hovered directly below me. They circled to the ground. And there before my eyes, stark and silent, lay the Martians with the hungry birds pecking and tearing brown shreds of flesh from their dead bodies. Later, when their bodies were examined in laboratories, it was found that they were killed by the putrefactive and disease bacteria against which their systems were unprepared. Slain, after all, man's defenses had failed by the humblest thing that God, His wisdom, has put upon this earth. This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen, out of character, to assure you that the War of the Worlds has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo. Starting now, we couldn't soap all your windows and steal all your garden gates. By tomorrow night, so we did the best next thing. We annihilated the world before your very ears and utterly destroyed the CBS. You will be relieved, I hope, to learn that we didn't mean it, and that both institutions are still open for business. So goodbye, everybody, and remember, please, for the next day or so, the terrible lesson you learned tonight. That grinning, glowing, globular invader of your living room is an inhabitant of the pumpkin patch, and if your doorbell rings and nobody's there, that was no Martian, it's Halloween.
Tonight, the Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations coast to coast has brought you The War of the World by H.G. Wells, the 17th in its weekly series of dramatic broadcasts featuring Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the air. Next week, we present a dramatization of 3 famous short stories. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
That very next day, CBS ordered Orson Welles to hold a press conference. And you'll hear this short clip, but he tells the reporters that he had no idea that this type of reaction would happen. As I said, this was part of Mercury Theater program. This was number 17 of the Sunday program. His first one was Dracula, and then he did some great classics. And so program number 17 ended up being War of the Worlds. None of the other shows caused any kind of concern, but this certainly did. This is one of his comments.
I am terribly shocked by the effect it's had. I do not believe that the method is original with me or to the Mercury Theater's presentation.
Do you think there ought to be a law against such enactments as we had last night as a result of that?
I don't know what the legislation would be. I know that almost everybody in radio would do almost anything to avert the kind of thing that has happened, myself included, but I don't know what the legislation would be. We simply, radio is new and we are learning about the effect it has on people. A story, fine H.G. Wells' classic fantasy, the original for so many succeeding comic strips and adventure stories and novels, about a mythical invasion by monsters from the planet Mars should have had so profound an effect upon radio listeners.
And of course the papers, front page, all across the country. This is the New York Times, the Daily News out of New York. This is a farmer by the name of Bill Dock, who lived near Grover Mill. He is recreating himself for the media that he went out to hunt Martians with a shotgun. A funny thing that happened, here's the water tower at Grover's Mill, and it's still there, by the way. This was nighttime, and when they described these tripod machines with the long legs, killing the army and people, everybody started shooting at the water tower, and the water supply for Grover's Mill disappeared. I was underwater for a while until they repaired the tower. Grover's Mill has a plaque, and they have a 100th anniversary coming up in 2038. There's this time capsule inside this, and they're not going to open it up till 2038, and they'll have a big celebration and all that in Grover's Mill, and see what's in the time capsule, celebrating the 100 years since the 1938 broadcast. But let me just mention a few things. Here's some descriptions. Women wept in front of their radio, so did their husbands. Everywhere, people ran into the streets, unsure of where to go or what to do. Many took their cars, speeding around like mad, covering their faces with wet towels to protect themselves from the Martian gas. Newark, New Jersey traffic cops watched dumbfounded as dozens of automobiles sped past them, going through red lights in the intersections, almost hitting pedestrians and other motorists. The cops had no idea what was going on. The panicked listeners tied up phone lines. They were calling their loved ones to warn them or just to say goodbye. Switchboards were totally jam-packed with phone calls both at the police headquarters, the newspapers, radio stations, and so forth. More than 6 million estimated listeners, and out of that, during 1938, 1.7 million were believed to take this as fact. And this was a study that was done two years later, in 1940, by Hadley Cantrell of Princeton University in a book called Invasion from Mars. So somehow, what happened is, they missed this last announcement, which was 44 minutes into the show, because they were already freaking out and driving every way you can imagine, trying to decide where to go. Another local from Grover's Mill was in such a hurry to drive off to reach his wife's family in Pennsylvania, he forgot to open the garage door first. Despite his wife screaming at him, warning him, he drove right through the door of the garage and yelled at his wife, "Well, we won't be needing that anymore." Another neighbor who had emptied a bottle of whiskey while listening to the show decided that his chow dog would be much safer in the kennel by the side of the house. He grabs the dog, rushes outside, and attempts to throw the dog over the fence into the kennel. The terrified dog grabbed onto his arm, wouldn't let go, and as he flung the dog, it tore his whole sleeve off, and the dog went up over the fence. The man then proceeded to drive to his brother's house, yank him out for a from a peaceful slumber, and take him on a wild, drunken ride, which ended when Orson Welles came on the air to say, it was just a play. There's so many examples of crazy things that happened during this whole episode. Here's a quote from a young college student. "My girlfriend and I were at a party in the Village, in Greenwich Village, New York. Someone turned on the radio. It was just when the Martians were spraying people at Grover's Mill with the heat ray. At first we couldn't believe it was happening, but it was so real, we stayed glued to the radio, getting more scared every minute. My girl began to cry. She wanted to be with her family. The party broke up in a hurry, and our friends scattered in all directions. I drove like crazy up 6th Avenue. I don't know how fast, 50, maybe 60 miles an hour. The traffic cop at the street crossing just stared at us. They couldn't believe their eyes, whizzing right past them, going through red lights, but I didn't care if I got a ticket. It was all over anyway. Funny thing, none of the cops chased us. I guess they were too flabbergasted. My apartment was on the way, so I stopped just long enough to rush in and shout up to my father that the Martians had landed and we were all going to be killed, and I was taking my girl home. And when we got to her place, her parents were waiting for us. My father had called them, told them to hold me there until he could send a doctor because I have gotten insane." So, and there's story after story after story. Fortunately, there wasn't a single death due to this, but we got to look later on. In Santiago, Chile in 1944, they recreated War of the Worlds, and of course when you do that, you recreate it to your country and your neighborhood, so you change the name of the locations and so forth to make it sound real. That caused a nationwide panic because the radio station was a national radio station. People fled into the streets, they barricaded inside their houses, and fortunately there was no injuries. But if we go to 1949 in Quito, Ecuador, a radio station did not publicize that it was a hoax, just as Orson Welles did publicize it. It didn't make any difference because many listeners believe the attack was an invasion from Peru. At that time, Ecuador and Peru didn't get along. They were basically enemies. Some people thought it was the Soviet Union that was invading, not really the Martians. And when the radio station realized the panic that was going on outside, they announced, "Oh, this is just a hoax. We're just recreating a fictitious broadcast." The rioters were so upset with being duped that they got kerosene and newspapers, lit them, burned the radio station to the ground. There were 100 people in the radio station. Most of them escaped out the back door. Unfortunately, 10 went up to the 3rd floor. All 10 of them burned to death. The government of Ecuador, instead of charging the rioters, issued arrest warrants for the 2 producers of the show. And they did arrest one of the producers, and when they were about to get the other one, he escaped from Ecuador. He just disappeared. Nobody knows where he went, but he got out of the country. So that was probably one of the worst. Actually, there was 20 employees that burned to death in that event. So if you go to Buffalo, New York, 1968, caused a little bit of panic. WKBW was the station. They did all kinds of publicity ahead of time. They had it in newspapers, on the radio. 4,000 people phoned the Buffalo Police Department and asked if the invasion was real. The Canadian National Guard sent troops to the 3 bridges leading into Canada from Buffalo, New York, near where Niagara Falls is, to keep the Martians from coming from New York up into Canada. And Braga, Portugal in 1988, 40 years after the Quito disaster in Ecuador, they did the same thing. They made up a hoax based upon War of the Worlds. 200 angry citizens stormed the station. Fortunately, they didn't burn it down, and there was no loss of life. So there you go. That's just examples. We didn't have any problem at the Orpheum Theater when we did it, and but it just shows you how radio hysteria and, as we call, misinformation and disinformation can really get people believing, especially if it sounds so real. So it's something that we still deal with, obviously, today. On that vein, we have a show coming up, the Great Plains Radio Theater, coming up on the 28th and 29th. And we're recreating some 1940s and 50s radio mysteries. And I've done this before. We did that for about 7 years in Arizona, and then back in 2007, we did quite a few shows here in Sioux City, including not only at the former Black Box Theater at Western Iowa Tech, but also we did 2 shows in the Scottish Rite Temple in their big, amazing arena there. We went to Sioux Falls and performed in the Orpheum Theater up in Sioux Falls. And we went back to the Orpheum Theater and did 1984, the classic novel, on the stage of the Orpheum. So this show is going to be at Western Iowa Tech. We are reprising the role that was in the premiere, which was Sorry, Wrong Number, which was our premiere production in the Black Box Theater at Western Iowa Tech. But we're doing 2 other plays too. We'll end up with Sorry, Wrong Number after the intermission. So we got some good sponsors for the show. We're a nonprofit agency. We got some good voice actors lined up from the Siouxland area, and we're certainly always looking for anyone else that's interested, including young voices. We have a number of young kids that also perform, and some of them that will be performing on the 28th and the 29th. The 28th is a Saturday night at 7, but then we do a matinee on Sunday the 29th. And we already have some of the assisted living centers around town bringing groups of people to come to see mostly at the 2 p.m. showing. But we'll have over 150 seats available there at the Rockland Center. And my wife Maji has cards, so if you're interested on the information to attend this, we do everything as if you were back in 1940s or 50s, before television really took off. And what we do is we spend almost not quite 2 hours, going through what it would be like if you were at home in your living room in 1940, 45, listening to dramatic radio. So we even do the jingles from the 1940s and 50s, radio jingles. We have singers that do the jingles, and some of them are really hilarious. We have jazz singers, both male and female, so we do some Sinatra songs and Ella Fitzgerald songs. And that's the way it was done. People would tune in the radio, you would listen to these programs, there'd be interruptions for some entertainment, there would be commercials, obviously, and then back to the next show. So we're doing 3 classic mysteries. The first one is not the War of the Worlds, is Three Skeleton Key. Vincent Price was the original voice in that. Then we're doing a story called Camera Obscura, which is a murder mystery that takes place at Santa Monica, California, at an actual location. And then we're going to finish up after the 10-minute intermission with Sorry, Wrong Number, which is an absolute classic radio drama, and with a kind of a very surprising ending to it. And we have a good actress who knows how to scream well. So, any of you are interested, we general admission is 10, but for anybody that's 55 plus, there's probably not too many of you 55 plus. It's $5, so feel free to grab one of those postcards, and hope to see you. Well, we do a real live production on stage. We have the sound effects person at a table doing Foley hand sound effects. We have digital music and other types of sound effects that we can't do by hand. And it's just a real kick. The actors love it because we usually get by with 2, at the most 3 rehearsals, which are called table reads, and we're good to go. And so we get a lot of stage actors who say, I love doing radio theater, because I don't have to spend 3 months memorizing my lines and then memorizing where I go and where I sit as I'm, doing my dialogue. Because in radio, you read from the scripts. So they'll be reading from the scripts, and they can focus everything on the character. Everything is for the ear. And what I ask the audience to do, and you'll see that if you go, is before the show, I said, during the show sometime, close your eyes. Keep them closed for a couple of minutes and see what happens. And when you close your eyes, it's amazing what your ears do with all the sound effects and the voices. It creates this mental picture of what people experience since the 1920s when radio started. It's why it's called theater of the mind. And I would look out in the audience during the show, and I'd see some people with their eyes closed up. Are they really sleeping? Are they bored? Well, no, because they have the big smile on their face, because they're really enjoying hearing the visual, mental picture of all the characters. So that's my presentation. I can answer any questions if you'd like.